Hello and welcome to another Caseware webinar. Today we'll be going over an introduction to Caseware Cloud. My name is James Wright and we're joined today by Phil Reeves. Phil, if we get the other slide on there. Perfect. If you have any questions during today's webinar, then do feel free to use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the screen. Any questions will be answered at the end of today's webinar in the Q&A section. However, if it's apt to ask it at that point in time during the webinar, I will throw it at Phil and put him on the spot to answer the question. And for anything that we can't answer during the webinar, we will follow up with a Q&A document that will be hosted on our knowledge base site. Perfect. Next slide there, Phil. Wonderful. I'll just hand over to Phil now to cover the agenda for you.
Yes, thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. As James mentioned, today's webinar is an introduction to Caseware Cloud. So we'll be going over some of the basic elements of the Caseware Cloud. So really, the idea of this session is to, or this webinar is to talk about some of the more basic elements of the Caseware Cloud. For those that may not have visited the Caseware Cloud before, for example, you may have recently visited, spoken to Caseware as part of our visit to Accountex last week, or it could be that you are just dabbling into the Caseware Cloud for the first time. So we really wanted to talk about some of the basic elements, entity staff, some of the setup elements of Caseware, what you really need to keep an eye out for when you are setting up Caseware Cloud, how we can get that information in that we need, what information we need to be able to then get going with our various different, cloud applications, whether that's audit, financials, company's house submissions, things like that. We're really going to cover, as I say, some of the basic parts of Caseware, looking at filtering and searching as well. As James mentioned, if anyone does have a question as we go through, please take a moment to ask. We've set aside some time within this webinar to answer any questions that you've got. And also means you don't have to listen to me for the entire 30 minutes. It means we can listen to James as well, which is much more preferable for me. So yeah, before we get going, I'm just going to close out of our slides. You can see the agenda, so we don't need that anymore. We'll come back to the slides a little bit later on. And I will jump into, hopefully everyone can see, the Caseware Cloud server.
All good there.
You see that, James?
Yeah, all good.
Excellent. Thank you. First things first, accessing Caseware Cloud. So a very basic element in obviously making sure that you're able to get into your Caseware Cloud servers. So the way the Caseware Cloud works is that every single firm client of ours that uses Caseware Cloud will have their own specific firm URL, their own specific firm instance. So for example, our one that you can see on the screen is uk.casewarecloud.com/education. Generally, that initial prefix where we got UK will be either UK, could be EU, or it could be IE for those that are based in Ireland. And generally, obviously, if you're based in the UK, you'll be on the UK server bank. If you're based in Ireland, you'll be in the Irish selection. We do sometimes put users on the EU one, but again, that's just to manage the load of the servers. On that point, it is important that we do know our firm-specific URL when we're accessing the Caseware Cloud. So uk.casewarecloud.com, and in that / element where we can see education on this example, that is the firm-specific part of this. So I just highlight this education part here. That is the firm-specific element. So, depending on what our firm name is, that we do ultimately, depending on what software or what templates or applications we purchase, we have the choice of what we use for that firm specific element. But again, just to make sure that you're aware of that, not trying to access the Caseware Cloud of other users, because it's not going to work. Not trying to get onto this uk.casewarecloud.com/education one, because again, that's not going to give you access to that. So the actual cloud itself, once you're in it for the first time, will look slightly different. This is obviously a working education server that we're using all the time for training purposes. Your one will have a lot less information initially within the system. So the first screen that loads up when we access the Caseware Cloud is the timeline screen. So the timeline is not a timeline of all activities to take place in the Caseware Cloud with regards to, I don't know, James, who's on the call with me today. As you would have seen already, James has completed a document within an audit file. It's not going to tell me that within the timeline. What it's going to tell me is about collaborations that take place both internally and externally with our contacts. So if James has gone through and sent an information request to a contact, so by contact we're referring to your clients, that's going to be appearing within the timeline. If James sets up some of the collaboration features within the cloud, the tasks and the discussions, if he sets up a task for myself, again, that would show within the timeline. So how much shows on the timeline really depends on how much you're going to use the collaboration features that are included within the Caseware Cloud. There are a lot of options as to what we have as a launch screen. As I say, timeline is the default one for any users on the Caseware Cloud. If I was to want to change that at all, which I can do, all I need to do is go to my initials on the right-hand side, go to my settings, and from here we have the option to go to startup settings. So these startup settings are user by user specific. As you can see, I've already changed mine on my system to load onto the entities window, which we'll come to in a minute. But you can see some of the different options that we have for that load up screen, whether it's entities, whether it's contacts, where we could go through and create a specific dashboard within the Caseware Cloud. So we only see information like what files we're working on, what stage of the files that we're in, all sorts of different things that we can add onto those dashboards if we want to, and we can create those as well. If you want some information on dashboards, please feel free to chuck something into the Q&A feature, specifically to James or just in general, and we can get that information sent across to you. Now, the reason mine's saved as entities is really to do with one of the key elements of Caseware Cloud with regards to filtering. There is one very powerful filter built across the entire Caseware Cloud system, which is this drop down in the top left-hand side. At the moment, mine's selected to all entities, which essentially means that regardless of which slide or which area of the Caseware Cloud I'm in, Caseware will always show me all information in relation to every single entity that I've got saved into the Caseware Cloud. If I was to click on that drop down and select a specific entity, ABC Motor Company PR Limited, for example, what Caseware is going to do is it's going to filter not just the timeline, but every single area of the Caseware Cloud to only show me information that is relevant to ABC Motor Company PR Limited. When we're talking about entities, we're talking about your clients. Every single audit that you're doing, if you're looking to in the future, once when we start to get people up and running on the cloud financials software, if you're looking to make use of that cloud financials software, for every single set of financials that you're producing on the Caseware Cloud, you'll need a separate entity built into the Caseware Cloud. So the real issue, well, not necessarily an issue, but the real thing to be aware of and to look out for when you are selecting this drop down, or if you've selected an entity, is that, again, it will filter both this screen and every other screen. So this 3 lines button, which we'll come back to in a minute, is our navigation feature. And our navigation feature will allow us to select various different templates. For example, UK Company Audit Mercia, for example, UK, if we go UK Micro Financials. If I go for the sake of argument, just a UK Company Audit, in this example, you can see there aren't any UK company audit files built for ABC Motor Company PR Limited. I've been quite tidy, deleted them all ahead of this session, which means realistically that I'm going to go into here and go, okay, well, I haven't got any audit files, but actually I do, just not for this company. So if I click on this drop down again and go to all entities, you can see actually we've got a heck of a lot of different training audit files built into the software. I just can't see them because of that filter drop down. Just something to be aware of. We do need to make sure that we either select this as all entities or that we go to the correct entity that we're looking to find information for using the drop down here. Now, part of the reason why I have mine driven to my startup screen set it to entities is because that way I can access the appropriate entity, and that will then obviously filter the different screens based on the entity that I select. Now, as I said previously, entities is an important part of the Caseware Cloud system. So when you've got your system set up, you do need to make sure that you've set up the different entities. Now, you can import those, you can create them manually it really depends on the number of entities that you have to create on the Caseware Cloud system. If it's only one or two, then you create them one at a time. If you've got to put 70, 80, 90 different entities in, you may be more inclined to go to the new button and press import. Now on here, very quickly, there are three types of entities that we have: a client, an other entity, and an internal entity. Realistically, most, I'd say 95%, maybe even more, of all entities that are created on the Caseware Cloud are clients. On your cloud system, again, it'll be a lot tidier when you first set it, when you first get access to it. You'll only have one entity set up by default, which in our case would have been this one here. I've ticked on the left-hand side to indicate that. When Caseware sets up the cloud system, they set up one entity for every single firm, and generally that's the name of the firm. We have to set up, there has to be an entity on the cloud system for us to set it up. That then gets associated with the staff that we create on the Caseware Cloud and things like that. You don't really have to do anything with this. Just don't delete it. Just make sure you leave it in there. Again, don't even have to touch it if you don't want to.
Phil, we have had a question in. It says, they say, please can you advise whether Working Papers has been put on the cloud or is it solely for audit purposes?
So Working Papers is I assume you're referring to accounts in general, because Working Papers is actually obviously the desktop software. At this moment in time, it's audit, but I believe they are launching Caseware Financials if they haven't already on the Caseware Cloud. So that will initially be FRS 102, FRS 105, and then obviously going into the future, there'll be 101, IFRS, etc., available within the Caseware Cloud. So it is coming if it's not already available.
I believe it is as of, I think it was released on Accountex, at least the 105.
Yeah, I know there was a lot of chat about it at Accountex, but
yeah. And another question is just coming from the same user there. Do you know when the Caseware Financials is launching? And again, it would be along the lines of, I believe it's, if it hasn't been, it will be soon. But yeah, we are launching them as they come out, basically the 102s and 101s, that kind of thing.
As you said, 102 initially. If in doubt, I would just say to speak to the account manager or your account manager. They'll be able to give you some more information about that. They're a lot more privy as to when things are going to be released than we are. We see the software and we train on it, but in terms of new software, we're not necessarily the top of the line as when it comes to when that's going to be released. So, I'd say get in touch with the account manager if you're interested in that at all. Okay, going back to, as I say, entities. When I click on the drop down, we have the option for client. So when we're creating these new entities, as I say, we can import that. There is a layout that we have available. Again, if you want that, I can get that sent across to you. So just chuck a message to James in the Q&A feature, the layout of what is required. But as a minimum, if I click on client, we need a name and an entity number. A name would be the name of the company, or ideally, again, it can be pretty much anything that you want it to be. Entity number, again, is a reference number that you've got for that particular client in the Caseware Cloud. There's no certain layout. It can be a collection of numbers and letters. It's really up to you what you include on there. If I just go to one of the examples, we've got James Test Limited here, which see JC001 is the entity number. So it's a combination of numbers and letters. Just for those that, again, as a quick pointer for anyone who does decide to, in terms of Cloud Financials, decides to take up on that particular product, one thing you will want to do at this stage is go to organization type, select private company or type of company, for example, as private company. And then at the bottom, want to include that. You can only get the option for company registration number if you select private company. The reason for that is that company registration number drives directly into areas of the product. So again, just something to be aware of. When you create these entities, there is an option for limited. The limited option will limit who can access this. Limited is probably not the best word for it, but it's almost like restricted. We're restricting access to this particular entity only to those staff that we share it with. Sorry, James, I've just seen the question. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, that's fine. So we've just had this question in, just for everyone else watching. A Caseware Cloud and SmartSync the same thing? If not, what's the difference between them?
That's a great question. Caseware Cloud and SmartSync work together in harmony, essentially. Caseware Cloud, from a desktop perspective, is really the storage location for those files. SmartSync element is the synchronization between the desktop and the cloud. So they work together. Caseware Cloud's where you keep your working papers files. SmartSync allows it to synchronize down to the desktop product. So you're working on the file in the desktop, you're synchronizing that back up into the cloud, and it's storing that data in the Caseware Cloud so that other users can pull that information down if they need to. Hope that answers the question.
Perfect, yeah.
So they're sort of the same but different. SmartSync's just one element of it. Okay. As I say, entities, we would use the client option. Now, so we need a separate entity for every single area. You know, if we're doing from again, some of the users on this call will be using Caseware Cloud for SmartSync purposes. When we're going through and we're using SmartSync, again, we need a separate entity in the Caseware Cloud for all the files that we're creating on the desktop and synchronizing up into the Caseware Cloud. So you do need to make sure that you do create those entities. Now, just on a point of one thing I mentioned when we were talking about the agenda is potential errors that can occur. So if you're logging into the Caseware Cloud, or if you're accessing the Caseware Cloud from the desktop product from a SmartSync perspective, and you're unable to create entities, or you come into the entity screen and you're not able to click the new button, creating entities is very much an option that is limited to certain users within the Caseware Cloud through permissions. So when users are setting up staff, when we set up the initial admin within the Caseware Cloud, so again, going back to the setup process, we would set up the new Caseware Cloud system for you as a firm. You would then, or the person who has requested that cloud system would automatically become the first admin within the Caseware Cloud. It would be their job to then add all the rest of the staff in. And when they do so, they can set permissions for each of the users as they set them up, or to do it as a group. So if I go back to the 3 lines button, you can see we've got the option for staff. So we have to set up the entities and then we have to set up the staff. As you can see, we've got loads of staff already built into our Caseware Cloud system. But if I go to the new option here and press add new staff, you can see I can add a new member of staff into the Caseware Cloud. And again, anyone that you want to be able to access the Caseware Cloud, anyone that you want to be able to use the SmartSync element of Caseware from a working papers perspective, you do need to make sure they are set up with access to the Caseware Cloud, and they are set up by setting them up as a member of staff on the system. So when I go new and I add a new member of staff in, so with entities first and then staff, we have the option here for email, so we can provide an email address for that member of staff, a first name and a last name. Again, that is a minimum requirement for any new member of staff that we add into the Caseware Cloud system. Please be aware of the cloud remaining licenses on the right-hand side. Obviously, in this case, we've got 9 licenses remaining. If I select the question mark icon, I can see how many active we've got, how many have been purchased, and obviously, ultimately, the difference would be the number that are remaining. Caseware will not let you go above the number of licenses which you purchased. There are instances where if users leave, we might need to adjust that slightly. And there's a certain step that we can follow to do that, which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing that we need to be aware of when we're setting up these new members of staff is firstly the password, which is set by the user. So when you set up a new member of staff, they will have the ability to set their own password through an activation email. That activation email is only valid for 5 days. If in the event that that user doesn't access their account within that 5-day period, if I go to this user just as an example, because I'm pretty sure they've not logged in, there you go, you can see I can have the option to go into as an admin and reset the password.
We have had another question in. Are licenses for concurrent users?
Bear me 1 second. So is that so you mean essentially those that are actually going to use the software?
Yeah, I believe so. The licenses on the cloud, then they take from a license pool in a way. So
yeah, so
it's a little bit differently.
Yeah, so essentially, you say you purchase 10 licenses, you set up 10 members of staff, they automatically get allocated to 10 licenses. There is an option to make a user inactive, which we'll talk about in a second, which will essentially release one of the licenses for us to then activate someone else. Now, we can't use the inactive like on every single day. Oh, that person's not in the office today, to try and cheat the system and purchase, say, 5 licenses for 10 users. It doesn't work like that. Realistically, if it's someone that's going to be working on the software, the majority of the time, they need their own license to be able to use the software. It's not the first 10 people that access the Caseware Cloud system will be the first 10 people that can use the template. It's not in that sense. It's a license gets applied to each user. Okay. Yeah, so password mentioned, set by the user. We can reset it if we need to. Now, this is an important part of it. As I mentioned, again, system-wide roles, permissions, what people can do on the Caseware Cloud. This is a lot. There's a lot of differences on really what we want people to do when it's Smart Sync and in comparison to if they're going to be using the cloud applications. For Smart Sync users, realistically, there's not a great deal that you're going to be doing on the Caseware Cloud, bar storing files and downloading files. So realistically, you can set everyone up as an admin from a Smart Sync perspective, or as a minimum, you want everyone to be an entities admin. If you're looking at it from a Caseware Cloud application perspective, so I'm talking to those that use Caseware Audit or potentially Caseware Financials when it's or when you can access it, you really want to think a little bit more about what you want people to be able to do. An admin gives you full control of the entire Caseware system, the Caseware Cloud system. So you, in theory, can manage the application. You can add additional staff in. You can monitor. You can control who has licenses in the Caseware Cloud system. You can, adjust, as I say, adjust the template. You can, in theory, remove an existing admin from being an admin by having the admin rights. It's really something that you want to be wary of. So you want to potentially think about what roles you're going to give different users. Now, just very quickly, you can go to the freelance. I know there's a question, James. I'll come to you in a sec. We'll go to the freelance button. If I go to settings, I have the option for security here, and in here I have role permissions. Now, what this will show me is a complete list of all the different roles I have access to, or that we have available by default on the Caseware Cloud. The ones with a padlock are the standard ones, which we can't amend. But I can click on one of these roles, and I can see exactly what rights and rights and controls I have on this Caseware Cloud, or if I was an admin, or if I was an owner or an editor. From the perspective of those that are going to be looking to just work on the Caseware Cloud from an audit, and again from a financials perspective, if you want a user who can just log in and work on those specific files, editor is the minimum that someone needs to be able to go in, edit an audit file, and work on an audit file, sign it off as prepared by, sign it off as reviewed by, whatever level they're doing. Admins is really about focusing on the individual aspects of the Caseware Cloud, what they can do, and as I say, controlling some of these more specific settings within the Caseware Cloud. Now, question, James.
Yeah, so we've had a question in from someone asking about they've got some users that are part of a team that only really need to have read-only access. Will this use up like one whole license on the Caseware Cloud in that case, or can we just assign them read-only?
Yeah, it's a good question. You do have an option within, and again, I won't go through this in too much detail because I'm wary of the time, but there is an option available. And again, if you want some more information, we can send it across to you. You can set, for example, that tax person up as a read-only, from a read-only perspective, as one of these contacts. So a contact, as you can see, there's an option here, contact viewer, which we talk about contacts from the perspective of your clients. But in theory, a contact could also be a internal member of staff who doesn't need full access to the software, but just needs it from a reviewer perspective, or just to view content, for example. We could do it that way. We would set someone up as a contact of the specific file they're looking at. And then from there, we would give that contact only access to the file that they need to look at. So whether that's an audit file or an accounts file, a financials file, we can give them access just to that file. They wouldn't be able to do any work on that file. They would literally just be able to, as it said in the question, just read only, essentially. Again, we can send some more information on that if you want to explore that particular option.
I believe they do. So we'll send some information across after the webinar.
Excellent. Okay. So when I was talking about just very briefly, we talked about staff from the perspective of obviously and roles from the perspective of making sure that people have the right roles within the Caseware Cloud so that they can't do too much or too little from what they want to do. What you also need to be aware of is licensing in the Caseware Cloud from the perspective of individual products. So by default, the way the Caseware Cloud works is that when you set up a new member of staff, they would automatically get allocated into a group, which is called all staff. So if I go to the three lines button, which is our navigation option, again, going to groups. In groups, you can see we've got an all staff group, which all staff members in the organization will automatically be added to this group. Now, the default requirement within Caseware, or the default settings within Caseware Cloud, which you can't change, or it's for everyone to be added, as I say, to the all staff group. The other default element of this is that in the standard Caseware Cloud settings, the groups, the staff have access to all applications. So all of these in your servers will be, whatever one, not all of them, because you won't have access to all the applications, but all the ones you've got licenses for will be ticked in this list. So if I'm doing, company audits, I'm doing academies, I'm doing pension audits, I'm doing charity audits, I'm doing, disclosure checklists, whatever, they will all be ticked by default within our Caseware Cloud system. And that is really something to be aware of if you're differing the number of licenses you have per product. So say, for example, I've only got like 3 licenses for disclosure checklist, but I've got 10 for company audit. The way that Caseware works on the system by default is that the first, in that scenario that we're discussing, the first 3 people that get added to the Caseware Cloud will be the 3 people that get access to the disclosure checklist template. So that would be, in theory, the first admin plus 2 others. They might not necessarily be the 3 people that are accessing the Caseware Cloud system. So what users may do in some instances, and what we do suggest people do, is to set up groups. So you can set up groups within here. If I go to the groups option, we can set up a new staff group. And within the staff group, you can actually manage both the role permissions that people have available to them. So via system-wide roles, we can say, all right, we want this group of people to be entities admins. What we can also control is the application access for those staff. We can say, right, this group, we want to be the group that can access UK Disclosure Checklist Mercia, for example. And that will reduce the number of licenses that are available based on the number of members in that group. So if we put, for example, in our scenario, we had 10 overall users, but only 3 with Disclosure Checklist, we would add 3 members to that group, and those 3 members would by default get access to the UK Disclosure Checklist template. So again, from a staff perspective, you need to be looking at this not just from a general cloud perspective, but also from a licensing perspective. Now, if we're on staff or we're on entities, just very briefly, because again, I know that I want to make sure we've had questions as we go through, but just in case we have any at the end, built into all of these screens, staff, also into the applications themselves, also into the entities, there are these search functions at the top. There's also a filter function on each individual page. So if from a search perspective, I could search for a specific member of staff. Let's go for, let's just find someone that we already know is on the screen. So we go Duncan Adams. We'll be able to find that specific member of staff. We'll be able to click on them, and obviously we can adjust their profiles accordingly. We can also search for or we can filter this information. So we might filter it via position if we're setting up positions on the Caseware Cloud. We can set it up by staff groups. So if I just want to see, groups can be based on, as we said already, applications. Some people base them on different offices. We can filter that just to show people that are within a specific office if we want to. Now, one thing I did say I'd mention on the staff as well is if we have to make someone or the inactive element, as we can see here, Daniel Barker is inactive. If a member of staff was to leave the firm, or if a member of staff was to take an extended period away from the firm and therefore was not working on the Caseware Cloud anymore, what you have the ability to do is to make an existing member of staff inactive. So if we click on someone, just very quickly, go to the pencil icon, that status, we can choose to make them inactive. What that will do is it will release the cloud license at the top of the screen. So for example, at the moment we're at 9, that would make it 10. The inactive person would never be able to access the Caseware Cloud again until we made them active again. The inactive element not just releases one of the cloud licenses for you to then apply to another user, but it also retains any sign-offs that they've done. So from an audit perspective, if they're signing off documents as a reviewer or a preparer, we want to be able to maintain that content. We don't want to really have to have someone else go through and prepare all that, or say that they prepared it again and sign off all that content again if it's already been done by one person. So just to be aware, you do have that option. Now, as I say, we can't use that, every single day. I can't go, my colleague James, we'll just use James Cruz as the example. I know his name's not James Cruz, but we can't say, oh, James Cruz isn't in today. Let's make him active and apply it to someone else. It doesn't work like that. It's more of a long-term resolution in terms of making people inactive. But again, if you want some more information on inactive, please let us know. Now, obviously, we've gone through some various different information and some questions already. I'm just wary of the time, but I don't mind overrunning by a couple of minutes. So I'll pass back to James for any questions that we've got. If anyone wants more information on anything that we've discussed so far, please feel free to drop us a message. But back to you, James.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's been no further questions. So if we go through the close-up slides and see if we get any questions in the meantime, yeah, just a quick reminder on here of how you can submit your questions if you do have them. There's just a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen there. If you jump onto the next slide for me there, Phil. Wonderful. A reminder, we have a list of our upcoming webinars on caseware.com/UK/resources and /events. On there, you can see all the upcoming webinars and register them as you have done for this one. And the next slide there, Phil. Perfect. And just a bit of promotion from our side of things. We do have a LinkedIn channel specifically for the client services side of Caseware. So more education and media based posts for you there. And also the Caseware Client Services YouTube channel as well. So that's where we store all of our quick vids. And in addition to storing all the recordings. So for example, this webinar will be recorded and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel there. Wonderful. We have had a couple of questions come in. Where Phil mentioned that once someone is set to an active, they will not be able to sign into the Caseware Cloud until they're made active again. Is it true for companies using SSO, single sign-on there? As I'm sure within my company, we have set some users to an active, but they've since used single sign-on to go back in and reactivate their license.
We'll have a look at that and we'll come back to you on that as mentioned. I don't see why they would be able to reactivate their licenses unless they were set up as admins, but I'll come back on that one.
Yeah, I'll chat to our IT specific team in support. We've got another one as well, just a quick question here. Sometimes, and not all the time, I'll go into the cloud and click on a client and a different company comes up. Why is this? It doesn't happen all the time. Well, in that case, what I'd suggest if it is the next time it does happen, just give our support team a call and just show it to them on screen just so they can log it. And if it is a bug or an issue like that, we can get our development team to look at it. But without the backup on that as a case, we can't really log anything. So the next time it does happen, just leave the screen as it is, give our guys a call, and you can present your screen to them. And they can see if there's actually anything that's gone wrong in the back end or any of the setup for you there. We don't have any other questions at the moment. So the next slide there, Phil. And a reminder that we have our help site, which is now my.caseware.com. The help.caseware.com site is still active for the time being, but we are doing a bit of migration work in the back end. So we'll be working our way over to that my.caseware site. The difference between the two is we've kind of homologated with our guys internationally. So all of the articles on there will be from UK and the different regions around the world. And you can filter by region as well as same by product as you used to be able to do on there. Perfect. We haven't had any other questions in since. So thank you for attending today's webinar and we'll see you on the next one.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone.